Somebody has said that gossip is more popular than literature, which makes me ask, what is gossip? I did a little digging, and one explanation of its origin is that it goes back to a social event of childbirth. That is, when a lady was about to give birth, all the ladies, her friends and relatives, would gather together for a social event. And while they were waiting for this baby to be produced, they would sit around and chit-chat. And that was called gossip. The first person to use gossip as a verb was Shakespeare. Now, does that mean that gossip is idle talk, which is all it meant in that context? What is gossip? Then, of course, I want to ask, what is gossip in the Bible? And since we're going through the book of Proverbs, I want to know, what is the word gossip in the book of Proverbs all about? Well, I found out that there are a couple of words that are translated gossip or talebearer in the scripture. In the book of Proverbs, one word that only appears 4 times means to murmur, whisper, backbite, slander, or be a talebearer. Another word, which only occurs twice in Proverbs, means to slander, be a talebearer, or an informer. So with that in mind, what I'd like for us to do today is talk about gossip. Now, you almost think, yeah, I know you're not supposed to do it, but let's see what the scripture says. Now, in this series, I've been taking the topics in Proverbs and going through them, and I'm talking on gossip today because that's one of the topics in Proverbs. But I want to start someplace else. I want to start with Moses, not Solomon. So the first verse I'd like for us to look at is in Leviticus 19:16. Leviticus 19:16 says, "You shall not go about as a talebearer among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. I am the Lord." He only says it once, I repeated it twice, but that's Leviticus 19:16. Years ago, a lady wrote an article on this verse, and she said, and I quote, "This verse brings to mind the picture of a person making her way through the ranks of the already murmuring and unhappy Israelite travelers. As she goes up and down among the people, she whispers the latest news of the camp. Don't quote me about this, but I heard that Moses may be on his way out. There are other men, you know, who could lead us just as well as Moses anyway, maybe even better. And by the way, have you noticed how Zurel's family is always the first group to go out and gather manna every morning? I probably shouldn't mention it, but there's no need to be greedy, if you ask me. Oh, and there's that rambunctious Ashabel's boys again. I do wish their parents wouldn't control them a little better. I don't like to talk about people, but he I think this is misprint, but his way he lets those boys behave, and it's just a shame. Now, I thought she captured what we normally think of as gossip, and she used that to explain Leviticus 19:16. So you get the drift. But Moses just says, don't do it. 19:16 says, you shall not go about as a talebearer. Just don't do it. Now, we knew that, but I just want to point out that Moses said that. There's another verse that Moses wrote that I want us to look at, and it's in Exodus. So turn to Exodus 23:1. Exodus 23:1 says, "You shall not circulate a false report. Do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness." Now, you've heard me last time talk about the word witness in the book of Proverbs, and I suggested that many commentators, every time they see the word witness, think of that it's being a witness in court, and that's the same case here. So it says, don't put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness, and that may be talking about being in court, though it doesn't necessarily have to be restricted to that. But the first part of the verse says, "You shall not circulate a false report." And that is obviously outside of court. So this verse in Exodus is saying, don't repeat a false report and don't be an unrighteous witness. You are not to conspire with the witness to defend the guilty, is the idea of the witness part. But in short, the verse is simply saying, do not repeat a false report and don't be a talebearer. Don't circulate a false report. Somebody's written, it's time to plant your spiritual garden. As you plant, may I suggest the following rules for your garden. Plant 6 rows of lettuce. Let us be unselfish and loyal. Let us be faithful to duty. Let us search the Scripture. Let us not be weary in well-doing. Let us be obedient in all things. Let us love one another. Plant 3 rows of peas, purity, patience, and perseverance. Plant 3 rows of squash. Squash indifference, squash criticism, and squash gossip. Now, that just sort of summarizes what I think Moses is telling us about being a talebearer or being a gossip. He would just say, don't do it. Squash it. Now, I'm deliberately going to Moses first because I want to make a point about Proverbs later. But to sum up the 2 verses I've looked at thus far in Moses, all those 2 verses are saying, and I can't think of any better way to say it than squash it. Don't do it. Just don't do it. That's Moses. Now, let's see what Solomon has to say about gossip. There are only a few proverbs about it, but they are very insightful. The first one is a little interesting. It's in Proverbs 18:8. Proverbs 18:8 says, "The words of a talebearer are like tasty truffles. They go down into the innermost body." Now, while you're at it, look at Proverbs 26:22. Proverbs 26:22 says, "The words of a talebearer are like tasty truffles, and they go down into the innermost belly." Sound familiar? Have you heard that someplace before? Yes. In other words, Proverbs 18:8 and Proverbs 26:22 are identical. It's saying the same thing twice. And they're identical verses. There's no difference between them. Now, as you've often heard me say before, God only has to say something once. But if he says it twice, then he is really meaning to emphasize that. So in this case, he's emphasizing it. The idea here is that you're swallowing something greedily. But the point is, people gladly swallow gossip as if it were a delicious dessert, and it settles in the innermost being, which of course is the mind or the heart. So people eagerly hear gossip. They swallow it like a delicious dessert. and it affects their innermost being. So one of the first things Solomon says in my organization of this about gossip is people love it. Isn't that true? People love gossip. One has said, good gossip is just going on. Bad gossip is the stuff that is salacious, mean, bitchy. You know, the kind most people really enjoy. And that's gossip. Another said, it's not technically gossip if you start the sentence with, now I'm really only concerned about, fill in the blank. Or someone else has said, it's almost as if listeners say, yum, yum, I like that, tell me more. Or someone else said, if you haven't anything nice to say about somebody, come sit next to me. People love gossip. I wonder if that explains the popularity of some TV programs or some articles, some sites on the internet. We just love the latest. We love gossip. One fellow said, there is no court in the country that will admit hearsay. But to many people, the words of gossip are equivalent to a sworn testimony. And isn't that true? But the point Solomon is making concerning gossip is we love it. Now, there are other things he has to say. Turn to Proverbs 16:28. Proverbs 16:28. He says, a perverse man sows strife, and a whisperer separates the best of friends. Interesting. He's now going to tell us the negative effects of gossip. And what he says is that gossip spreads strife and it separates the best of friends. Not just friends, the best of friends. All of us have friends, but we have that one or two that we would consider our best friends. That one that you think is the most loyal to you, that you would never have any problem with so serious that you would separate from each other. But this says that a whisper separates the best of friends. One commentator asked, who is the whisperer? And answers his own question by saying, could it be one of the friends? He suggests that insinuation, which is intended to engender suspicion and jealousy, is spoken of by one concerning his friends. Mutual coolness ensues, and neither can understand why. Then he says, confident attachments, the source of life's sweetest joys, are broken up, perhaps forever. Interesting. Gossip can separate the best of friends. So be careful what you say, especially about your friends behind their back. What you say could destroy a cherished friendship. Pascal said, I maintain that if everyone knew what others said about him, there would not be 4 friends in the world. What a telling comment, and perhaps with a lot of truth. Someone else said, friendship is like a book. It takes years to write and only a few minutes to burn. Boy, is that ever true? Or one other. Gossip destroys mental peace and enjoyment of him to whom they are uttered. They destroy the reputation and the interest of him of whom they are uttered. They destroy friendships and social happiness of both. Now, what I find interesting is this, that we looked at Moses first, and Moses says, don't do it. That's law. Solomon says it destroys friendship. Implied, don't do it. See the difference? I've tried to make the distinction as we've gone through Proverbs. This is not law. Meaning, what I've said so far is that a law is absolute and there are no exceptions. Or to say it like I'm saying it today, don't do it. A proverb is something that is generally true, and there may be exceptions. And as I went through these references to gossip, I thought this is a good illustration of the difference between law and Proverbs. Law just says, don't do it. Proverbs says, well, let me give you some wisdom. Let me give you some insight into how this works. Implied that if you understood the wisdom and the insight I'm giving you, then you would know how to conduct yourself. So, I think there's a difference between law and Proverbs. But there's more Solomon has to say. Look at Proverbs 11:13. In Proverbs 11:13 he says, a talebearer reveals secrets, but he who is a faithful spirit conceals a matter. Ooh, is this interesting? A talebearer reveals secrets. That's the whole idea behind gossip, is you're going to go tell somebody. But he says, he who is of a faithful spirit conceals the matter. Now, I think these two proverbs ought to be put next to each other, and I would suggest they're both talking about friendship. That he who is a faithful spirit, I think, is a reference to friendship. So, gossip can destroy friendship, but a faithful friend won't utter the gossip to start with. The nature of a gossip is to tell what they know. They just by nature break confidences. Faithful friends, however, know how to keep a confidence and how to refrain from telling tales. They do not betray trust. Years ago, I was friends with an older man, and I'm not sure I remember the details of what happened, but one of his friends had said something about him that wasn't necessarily wrong. It just took something and presented it in the worst possible light. And he was a bit grieved by that, and he was sharing it with me. And he said, you know, Mike, he said, your friends always present you in the best light. And I thought to myself, you know, there's a lot of truth to that, isn't there? If you're really a faithful friend, even if you know the negative, you don't repeat it. You tend to present them in the best possible light. I hadn't thought of this, and my judgment tells me, until just this moment, and my judgment tells me I shouldn't say it. And if I do, I'm going to get in trouble. But it's such a perfect illustration, and it just popped into my head. It fell right out of the sky. I'm not kidding. This happens a lot. The perfect illustration is our current president. That if you're a loyal defender of Donald J. Trump, he can send out a tweet that we twitch and say, I wish he hadn't done that, but you're going to present him in the best light. That's a perfect illustration of what I'm trying to talk about. That's what friends do. Now, I want you to turn to 1 Peter chapter 4. 1 Peter chapter 4. I think this is really important in this discussion. And I want you to look at verse 8, Peter is listing a number of commands. And then he says this, above all things, have fervent love for one another. For love will cover a multitude of sins. Is that not interesting? If you really love a person, then you just tend to overlook a multitude of sins. I submit to you that this should be the motto of marriage, because you can't live with another human being without finding their faults. I mean, it's just the nature of life. You don't even have to be married in most cases, but if you're married, you for sure will find their faults. I mean, it's just the nature of marriage. So what do married people do? They either make an issue out of the faults, and sometimes they're usually very minor things, and that leads to all kinds of problems, or, well, love just overlooks a multitude of sins. Now, I think this can be carried too far. I think, depending on the situation, that sometimes it needs to be confronted, but I think the spirit of this passage is that real love just overlooks a lot of faults. Matter of fact, he doesn't hesitate to say it overlooks sin of all things. So that's what Solomon is saying, that a faithful friends do not gossip. And I think Peter would add to that, that's because you love the person. And if you really love the person, you're not going to go around and tell other people about their faults. Now, Solomon has some more things to say. Look at chapter 20, verse 19. Now, what we've seen so far is people love it, but it is so powerful. It can separate the best of friends. So what do you do? Well, I think there are a couple of Proverbs that tell us what to do. And Proverbs 20, verse 19 is one of them. He who goes about as a talebearer reveals secret. Duh! Isn't that the very nature of what a gossip is? Sure. But notice, Solomon points that out to draw a conclusion. He says, he who goes about as a talebearer reveals secrets. Therefore, since that's the case, do not associate with one who flatters with his lips, meaning the talebearer. Solomon says, just don't even associate with those people. Now ponder that for a while. As I was preparing this, studying this, I thought to myself, some of these Proverbs are telling us we should not do that. You know, especially Moses and certainly Solomon. And the point is, I shouldn't be a gossip. And then I hit this proverb and I thought, wow, this is telling me how to handle gossip. That's different. Again, I want to make the little observation that law just says don't do it. And sometimes it doesn't bother to explain why. For example, do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not bear false witness. Do not steal. Those are the 10 commandments, some of them. And they don't tell us why. They just say don't steal, because God said, I said so. I'm holy, you be holy. That's it. A proverb sort of digs a little deeper and says, well, let me tell you some of the ramifications of that. And this is a case in point. We shouldn't do it. This proverb clearly says that. And then it says, let me tell you, therefore, people who go around gossiping, you shouldn't associate with them. Do not associate with them. They do not know how to keep their mouth shut. So just don't even associate with them. Don't be friends with them, I take would be the idea. Let me tell you what some other people have said about this. I got real intrigued on this one. One commentator says, a gossip betrays confidences. Therefore, do not associate with a babbler, because if he talks against others, you can be sure that he will talk against you to others. Don't associate with them. Another commentator says, since gossip betrays a confidence, a person ought to be careful with whom he shares secrets. So people who talk too much should be avoided, because they will probably divulge information that they should have kept confidential. Or another, beware of gossip. It may be your secrets next. Or to say it rather simply, there's a Spanish proverb that says, whoever gossips to you will gossip about you. Therefore, don't make a gossip your confidant. Don't associate with them in that sense. Another said, we would not wish him to look over our wall, much less enter into our house, and least of all associate with our family circle. So carefully select those with whom you reveal your secrets. If they reveal their secrets to others to you, they will reveal your secrets too. A moment ago, I had you look at 1 Peter, verse 8. Are you still anywhere near 1 Peter? Or did you turn back to Proverbs? I want you to consider a verse in Proverbs 4 again. Only this time I want you to look at verse 15. A minute ago we looked at verse 8. This is one of the most fascinating verses in all of Peter. I really am intrigued by this verse. Here is what it says. You got it? I want you to look at this one. 1 Peter 4:15. Got it? Fasten your seatbelt. Let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, a busybody, an evildoer, a busybody in other people's affairs. Is that interesting or what? Let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's affairs. Look, what intrigues me, this verse seems to be saying that a Christian could suffer as a murderer. Did you see that? I mean, there are preachers who preach that if you're a Christian, you would never do some sins, and you certainly wouldn't persist in them. And I've often thought this verse kind of really speaks to that, doesn't it? Can you imagine? And look at this verse. It says, let none of you suffer as a thief or any kind of evil doing. Let me ask you a question. Can a Christian do evil? Can a Christian be a thief? Can a Christian be a murderer? How about David? Okay? Next question. Would you like to associate with evildoers? No. Would you like to be real intimate friends with a thief? Now, I can see you befriending a thief to perhaps help him. But would you want to reveal your innermost secrets to a thief? Don't think so. How about having among your best friends murderers to whom you revealed all your stuff? Right? No. All right, look at the verse again. But let none of you suffer as an evildoer, suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a gossip, a busybody in other people's affairs. Would you associate with a murderer? No. A thief? No. An evildoer? No. Then don't associate with a gossip. That's what that verse is saying. What I find so fascinating is he lumps being a busybody in other people's affairs with being a thief and a murderer and an evildoer. So, back to Solomon. Don't associate with them. Just don't make them your intimate associates, because those kind of people will turn on you. Years ago, there was a man named Letourneau who owned a company that made large earth-moving equipment. Have you ever heard of him? He was a very committed Christian. He started out giving 10% of his money. This wasn't my point. I hadn't thought of this until just now. And then he increased it to 20 and then 30. And as I recall, he's the fellow who eventually ended up giving 90% away and keeping 10%. He was a very committed Christian. At any rate, he manufactured this earth-moving equipment that just takes up huge piles of dirt. You've seen them when they're constructing a roadway or something, a freeway. Well, he tells the story that we used to have a scraper known as Model G. Somebody asked one of our salesmen one day what the G stood for. And the salesman thought for a minute and he said, well, I guess the G stands for gossip. Because like gossip, this machine moves lots of dirt and it moves it fast. The point being, you wouldn't want to associate with dirt. That's associating with a gossip in the sense that you're making them your close associates. All right. You learned anything about gossip so far? Interesting stuff. People love it. But be careful. If you're hanging around the gossip, they're telling you gossip. They're telling others gossip about you. So be careful. Well, there's one more thing that Solomon has to say, and it's even more to the point. Look at Proverbs 26, verse 20. Proverbs 26, verse 20. Where there is no wood, the fire goes out. And where there is no talebearer, strife ceases. Do you remember earlier he said that the talebearer could cause strife? Well, now he says, and if there's no talebearer, there's no strife. If wood, to use his analogy, if wood is not added to a fire, it goes out. Likewise, if there is no gossip, strife ceases. Or as someone says, just as fuel feeds a fire, so gossip feeds trouble. Unless the troublemaker keeps adding exaggerations and gossip and lies, strife will soon die out. Or someone else put it like this: to quench the flame, we must take away the fuel. We must remove the talebearer, stop him in his words, compel him to produce authority, face him, if possible, with the subject of his tales. This decisive course will prevent a mass of slander and put him to shame. Another has said, the tale receiver and the tale bearer are agents of discord. If none received the slander in the first incident, it would not be propagated. Hence our proverb, the receiver is as bad as the thief. And our laws treat them equally. For the receiver of stolen goods, knowing they are stolen, is hanged as well as he who stole them. Another. It requires no ordinary exercise of Christian discipline to maintain the silence of love and to regulate both the tongue and the ear within its well-advised limits. Now, I've quoted several of these because of the phraseology. To quench the flame, we must take away the fuel. So just stop gossip in its tracks. The receiver is as bad as the thief, but my favorite is regulate both the tongue and the ear. I don't think I've ever heard of anybody regulating the ear, but regulate it, and it stops gossip. Now that, I think in our society that may be a little bold. If somebody started sharing things with you, if you just said, hey, I don't want to hear it, but I've done it. But what I've done more often is this. I've listened to it. But what I've done more often is say, how do you know that? You know? And particularly as a pastor, I have said, how do you know that? So I think there are times when we should challenge the gossiper. That's what Solomon says we should do, which means that's what God said we should do. One author wrote a little bit of a lengthy piece, but it just really kind of says it. He said this: the sky was cloudy, the wind was from the east, and it was cold. Sitting in a boat on the open water can really chill one to the bone, especially when the fish are not biting. So we went ashore to build a fire. Rekindling such a warm blaze could be a real joy in the open. It's easy if you know how. First, gather some bark, shavings, upon those places that are very small, dry twigs. Next, place some twigs a little larger, and upon those place some branches, and finally logs. Now we're ready to start a fire. No. Don't try to light those logs. We only have one match. Start the fire with dry bark at the bottom. That's it. Now those small twigs will catch fire, and soon the logs will be aflame. A fire begins very small, but if you give it, it will soon become big and even get entirely out of hand. Then, when there is danger of this, we must put out the fire. This can be done by dousing water on it or just letting it die out, by not adding more wood, for if there's no wood, the fire goes out. And then he says, James says the tongue is a little fire. By the way, James says that in chapter 3, verse 6. The best way to stop gossip is to douse it by refusing to listen. If this does not work, let it burn out by not repeating it. Don't add fuel to the fire. Remember, fire begins small, but if it's fed, it grows big. I thought that was a particularly vivid illustration. I was a Boy Scout once. Did you ever go out in the woods and try to start a fire? You don't start with the log. You start with the small twigs or paper or something that burns easy. So gossip starts small. Did you ever play the game where you put a bunch of people in a circle and one whispered to the next person, they whispered to the next person, they whispered to the next person, and you got to the end of the game and what came out of the mouth of the last person didn't exactly resemble what started with the first person? You ever done that? That's gossip. That's what gossip does. It just builds. You just have to add a little to the story, to make it a little more juicy. So, Moses says, don't do it. And Solomon tells us, why not? So if I were going to sum all this up, I would say simply, people may love gossip, and they do. But faithful friends do not repeat gossip, nor should we, because gossip destroys friendship, and not repeating gossip prevents strife. So the wisest thing to do is not even make a gossip your close friend. Don't associate with the gossip. Another has written, I am more deadly than screaming shells of a howitzer. I win without killing. I tear down houses, break hearts, and wreck lives. I travel on the wings of the wind. No innocence is strong enough to intimidate me, no purity pure enough to daunt me. I have no regard for truth, no respect for justice, no mercy for the defenseless. My victims are as numerous as the sands of the sea and often as innocent. I never forget and seldom forgive. My name? Gossip. That's what gossip does. So we should not participate nor promote it. I want to end by telling you something, and it is in different forms. I discovered, I know one form, which I'm going to give you in a minute, which I've used a lot, but I discovered it started with Socrates. Socrates said, strong minds discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events. Weak minds discuss people. In more modern times, a man named Henry Thomas Buckley said, quote, great minds discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events. Small minds discuss people. Then that evolved into people of high intelligence talk about ideas, people of average intelligence talk about things, people of no intelligence talk about other people. But the form that I've used, and the one I like, is wise men talk about ideas, ordinary men talk about things, and fools talk about each other. Where are you in the lineup? Let me tell you one more story. I hate to end on a negative note, so let me end on a positive note, all right? Years ago, the pastor of the Moody Memorial Church in Chicago was Alan Redpath. He said, quote, I once formed a mutual encouragement fellowship at a time of stress in one of my pastorates. The members subscribed to a single formula applied before speaking to any person or subject that was perhaps controversial. And here's what he did. He took the word think and he made each letter in think mean something. For example, the T, is it true? The H, is it helpful? I, is it inspiring? N, is it necessary? K, is it kind? But what I really liked about that is you should think before you speak. And the criteria should be, is it true, helpful, inspiring, necessary, or kind? What a great way to nip gossip in the bud. So I would like to suggest that you speak in such a way that you wouldn't be ashamed to sell the family parrot to the town gossip. Father, thank you for this reminder of how we speak about each other. Fill our hearts with love, shed it abroad in our spirit, so that we do the loving thing, which means that we may cover a multitude of faults. And Father, help us to speak the truth, kind words that minister to each other and build them up instead of tearing them down. In Jesus' name, amen.